This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
I'm Dakota Patterson. Some call me Champ VX. I'm the host of the Fresh Brewed Coffee Podcast. The Fresh Brewed Coffee Podcast is not a feel-good podcast, it's a feel-something podcast. Having the tough conversations that we all may be too afraid to have while prioritizing creating a space for vulnerability and humanness. Join the conversation every other Wednesday for the brew of the day on Apple or Spotify. It's brewing time.
On this week's episode of BiCurean, we had a powerful conversation with Dr. Stephany Rose Spaulding about the proposed Truth and Conciliation Commission and what it means to be an accomplice.
Hi, I'm Eric.
And I'm Aisla.
And together we are the hosts of the BiCurean podcast.
BiCurean is our answer to the polarizing culture we live in.
Tired of feeling under siege and looking for ways to get involved? Then come be a part of a different way of thinking.
Everything from politics to geek culture to current events that polarize us as a society, we explore multiple ways of looking at things.
Welcome to the show.
I am very excited to introduce our guest this week, Dr. Spalding, who has launched, founded, created, you're going to have to confirm this for people, the Truth and Conciliation Project. Thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And yes, I am one of the founders of the Truth and Conciliation Commission. And it's a grassroots movement calling for a federal commission here in the United States.
So, a commission to do what? I'm just going to start there.
Sure. So truth commissions generally happen in countries after mass human rights violations have taken place. And it's a fact-finding instance that governments generally sign off on because they are wanting to do the work of healing and reconciling in their nations. So South Africa was the first country after the fall of apartheid to have a Truth and Reconciling Commission. However, here in the United States, when we think about racial injustice and the systemic ways in which racism impacts our society and has impacted us for the last 500 years, there is no point for us to reconcile, because reconcile means that there was an agreement to begin with, and there was never one. So this is why this commission is a little bit different. It calls for conciliation, which asks us, after we tell the truth about the history of our nation, to find ways forward that are conciliatory, that will create this sacred agreement and allow us to move forward with equity and inclusive practices. And that's the hope for this work, is that we are able to build that sacred covenant that has never really existed in our nation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you both being part of launching that and also explaining what that meant. That's a very powerful place to stand, I think.
You just said something, and I believe I read this somewhere, so you can expand on this, because you just mentioned conciliation versus reconciliation.
Right.
What is the key there in those two terms for you?
And again, it's that truth moment. When we think about racial violence in the United States, beginning with the genocide of indigenous people, the landing of conquistadors in what we now know as Florida in 1513, they did not come with an agreement that respected the lives of those who were here. They were already operating under a papal bull that said, you can go and seize these lands because they're non-Christian, right? Mm-hmm. So that's not a sacred covenant of respect that both parties agree to. So when we think about to reconcile, it means to go back to a place of sacredness or a place of agreement, a place of covenant. None of that exists for us here in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it doesn't.
Yeah, I think fundamentally, I think that's one of the problems, is that when I hear people like talk about this, they're like talking about it as to what is owed or all of this sort of thing, but it's like this implied, I think it just tends to make people nervous because there's this implied thing like you said, there was an agreement that was broken or something, and when there was nothing like that. And you're right when you bring up that is the problem of the forebears that founded this country as it stands now, is that they all came here and basically said it's God's will that we're here and doing this, so we feel completely justified in whatever.
Absolutely. And the Doctrine of Discovery, which is that decree from the Pope in the 1400s that said you can go and occupy these lands because these people are not Christian.
Right. Like there's a selfishness and almost a committed ignorance around it that, and that's continued, honestly, what it feels like. And it's never been countered to say we need to actually see the people that are here fully. And that's where if you've listened to the show at all, I'm a huge fan of reparations. And fan's probably not the right word, proponent. And we've talked about that at different times with people, and it's been interesting to me. One of the things that I've seen change over the last couple of months with the protests and the situation with the death of, or I should say murder of, George Floyd, is that some of my friends who have been more reticent have actually been genuinely curious. Like, please explain to me why you're so for reparations. Like, it feels like I'm, being asked to pay for someone else's bad behavior. And I was like, well, I get that. Like, you're, for the most part, I know you go through the world trying to be a decent human being, but this isn't about something that happened 400 years ago. This is about stuff that's been happening systematically and is happening today, right? And then even things like Jim Crow, like, they don't understand that those like larger codified issues are things that were, they were born and it was still being done, let alone the continued stuff that's been baked into the system. And so that was like, but they're interested in hearing that now. They're asking those questions with a curiosity rather than a defensiveness. And I feel like, wow, that's a step that I had not expected and I'm very excited about.
Absolutely. And part of this work is to be able to teach in a lot of ways what has not been taught, what has not been discussed, that leaves people in this space of resistance because they just don't have the knowledge base, right? If I ask people about the Doctrine of Discovery, there will be blank stares. Mm-hmm. But then when we talk about the stealing of land from indigenous people and how that legally transpired under European systems, then it becomes, oh my goodness, right? How did I not know this? And the impact of it extends to modern society. If the land was never yours to give away or to possess and own, then we have a long tradition of having to make restitution for that. And we see impacts of it happening right now. When we think about pipelines and drilling and all of these access points that blow up into resistance movement because you have water protectors saying, if you do this, you are actually violating a treaty, right? You're violating law on both indigenous sovereign lands as well as U.S. law, and it's problematic. So this commission is not something that is a quick fix. It is a deep dive into a public discussion about who we are, a national discussion about who we are, for even Christians to understand how religion was utilized in a way to oppress other peoples is something that we need to wrestle with and to discern and heal from and dissect and do all of those things. And now is such a ripe opportunity because the energy is shifting. Something different happened with the murder of George Floyd in our country. And I think part of it is all of the energy and bubbling over from people being quarantined for 2.5 months and what that raised, and then just the outlandishness of watching the suffering of this man for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, coupled with other murders that led up to it.
Yeah.
I completely agree. And I do feel like something has shifted. It just, the protests haven't even stopped. It's been multiple weeks. And there's a commitment that I can see coming. And part of my thinking around this has been, okay, now what do we do to actually turn this into something positive and keep that momentum going? I love the idea of your commission. How do you feel, or other ways people could actually kind of keep this momentum going just in general, though, like with awareness and stuff, like Isla was saying? I'm getting questions from people that I would have never thought. My company did a big public post from the CEO, and we're a smaller startup, California based, and fairly diverse, all things considered. Is owned by Israelis, and have a really good mix of men, women, Black, Asian. I feel pretty good about it. And still, he's got this commitment and he wants to do this. And I actually wrote him and I said, okay, well, I've been doing this kind of work for a while. Let's put your money where your mouth is. I can bring you numerous resources. And he's actually excited. And I feel like, this is a great example of kind of the momentum that's happening right now, to be committed to even being more diverse and paying attention and educating everybody in the company about it. But so I'm curious, what do you think are kind of some of the other ways that people can kind of keep this momentum going?
Absolutely. So this is why the call for this commission is so timely, because it is intentional for organizations, communities, neighborhoods, states, governmental agencies to plug into a next step, right? When the protests die, or when a town has figured out, okay, we have finished our marching, we have shifted and reallocated our funding around policing, when they realize that is not enough, that there is more to do, our hope is that they will begin to plug into this commission, because it is a step of acknowledgement, then education, and then facilitating how to actually do anti-racism work. It's not enough to just acknowledge what has happened. We have to actively engage in dismantling the institutional ways in which racism permeates our society. So we have individuals who are prepared to do trainings. We are launching a way in which people can connect in their neighborhoods and communities and tell their stories. But other ways outside of the Truth and Conciliation Commission is to stay politically engaged, right? Because there are other things that need to happen. It's not just about police accountability and transparency. That's one bad fruit off of a poisonous tree, right? So we need people who will come out of this movement, who will run for school board positions, who will run for city council positions. We need people who will begin writing policy that dismantles different systems that have, again, perpetuated institutionalized racism. So that's another way for people to begin plugging into reimagining economically where our money goes, and how we do the work of building communities that have never received the financial equity that that is deserving of the violations against them.
Yeah, no, that's really important. And so when I used to work in the LGBT community, we had a project that I really thought was one of the more powerful projects we worked on. And we actually talked to a lot of funders about differentiating between identity and stigma. So the stigma of being LGBT is a burden that LGBT people bear because they're the ones being that. However, and that's the actual problem they're dealing with. It's not being LGBT. That's fine. And the same thing is the racism, the stigma that Black people face. They're bearing a community burden. So they have to deal with the impact of that. You know that. But the community is actually, it's a community problem. It's not Black people's problem. They're just stuck dealing with it because that's how we're doing it. And I feel like that was such an effective way to kind of explain, like, we're not doing this for LGBT people. We're not doing this for Black people. We're doing this for our community because our community is hurting. These folks are the ones who are disproportionately bearing the pain of the stigma, and it's super unfair. And so we might need to do some things to create equity for them because they have been pushed down by our unwillingness to bear our community problem and fix it. And that's our issue. But it also makes it so that everybody gets to participate. I really liked the way that they set that language up. It's that model of like do with, not for. However, it also really acknowledges like there are folks that are bearing this. It's unfair. We have to deal with that.
Yes, but the issue of racism, the disease of racism, actually belongs to white people.
To everyone, yeah.
Undoing that. And it's a liberation process for everyone, right?
Exactly.
That is the piece that has been so overlooked in a lot of the conversation is that you aren't doing me a favor as an African-American woman by doing anti-racism work. You are actually stepping into your own humanity by doing anti-racism work.
Right. I'm doing me a favor. I'm doing my kids a favor. I'm doing my community
Absolutely.
a favor. Like, and more than that, I'm doing what's right. Like, that's what we have to do if we want to get to where it's something we talk about. Like, you know, we have these ideals of what our country is, and maybe we've never lived up to them, but that doesn't mean they weren't good ideals and that we shouldn't give it a try.
Right.
Well, this actually brings up something for me because this is something that I have been asked about. And I know Aisla has been too, especially since everything sort of fired up on Memorial Day. I would love to hear your thoughts on just the idea of what allyship can look like, because I admit that once I have a chance to talk to people and they see where I'm coming from, it's always a good conversation. But I've got a lot of people that like, I want to help, but I'm not Black or I'm not this and that. And I'm just curious to hear from your perspective, like what are good suggestions for ways to present yourself as an ally?
So for me, as a professor of women's and ethnic studies, I have grown to the point of don't try to be an ally. Do not try to be an ally for the very reasons that we are already talking about. Because an ally stands in the place, I am going to help you. I am here to work for your liberation and not my own. The language of an accomplice is much more effective for me. An accomplice is stepping into this work because their life as well depends on it, right? So for me, the moment is calling us to even abandon the language of ally because that's comfortable. It's easy. You can tap into it whenever you want to. And whenever you get, it's too overbearing and it's too much for you, you can step away as an ally. But doing the work of an accomplice means that you are carrying just as much of the liability and the burden of having to be in this work because it's about your own life as well.
That might just be our audio clip for this episode. No, I love it. You're absolutely right. And I do. And it's been hard to explain. That's kind of what I was getting at. I'm just so afraid that some of this momentum's going to go away. And, we were noticing the host service is basically a hosting service that does all the hosting of our podcast episodes suddenly started bumping us up. And it's probably because we have more than a few shows related to equity, both racial, sexual identity, all that sort of thing. And it's interesting because it's kind of fun because we're the hot topic, but it's also like, yeah, I'm going to be really disappointed when everybody just goes back to normal. And I really want to do some work to prevent that. But I do love the idea of challenging people to be an accomplice, And
that's exactly in part why I put the call out and have been so committed in getting my hands dirty to make this commission happen. I don't want it to go back to normal. I don't want to return to that place where people are like, oh, we made some legislative gains, everything is fixed.
Yeah.
It's not. And it doesn't matter how much we legislate at this moment. If we are not transforming hearts and minds, if we are not shifting the culture, then we will come back to a place where more violence will happen, people will die, and whether it's through police violence or healthcare or education, housing, whatever the issue, the systemic issue will be, people will die, they will get frustrated, and we will continue this cycle of uprising and then sliding back to normalcy.
Well, you just nailed another thing that it's been on my mind a lot. Is I was not alive in the 60s, but I have to imagine that some of what's going on right now would probably remind people who were. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, wow, this is basically like a 40-year cycle that hasn't really ended. And it's been going on since basically 1865, sort of, in various different ways, as we, as a nation begrudgingly granted rights and all of these different things. And we have this civil rights movement. And I'm almost disappointed to say, look how little it did if we have to start it over again 40 years later.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
So I just caught up with Ibram Kendi. I am so in love with him. I was like, oh my gosh. And the way that he's talking about self-interest, and I extrapolate a little bit towards capitalism being a huge root issue around some of what this cycle is, in terms of, I feel like partially one of the things that happened around the COVID situation is that because we actually had funding and people could be home and eat, and like when this horrible thing happened, they were a little resourced. They could actually like put some time in, and they were saying like the protests continued. Usually they'll be on the weekends, but then during the week, people have to go back to work. But because they could go, they could keep going. And so there is this way in which I feel like the cycle isn't going to end until we address the ways in which capitalism and when he was talking about like self-interest as a justification for all of these atrocities across cultures, like it's not just the United States where it occurs, but obviously that's one we're focused on in this moment. And I'm just curious, like in terms of that with regards to the project, do you feel like that's an aspect that would be identified as part of the like structural changes, or is that, I feel like that's a topic people get very nervous about.
Oh, no, absolutely. We definitely have to look at the ways in which capital and the economy is tied to the oppression of people across the country and the historical oppression of people, because it's a both and, right? So for many white communities, yes, they could continue to show up every day and be out there protesting because there is a sense of security and I don't have to do this. But for communities of color, it was another indicator of I have nothing to lose. I have no money. I have nowhere else to be. I don't have a job anymore.
Yeah.
So that frustration and energy is also what's bubbling up around the sustainability of these protests, is because when COVID hit communities of color that were already suffering, it made it even worse, right? That that people are like, well, I don't have anything to lose at
Yeah.
this moment, because my families are suffering, and having food on the table is a shot in the dark, and hopefully these food pantries continue to sustain us. So yes, capital is very centrally tied. Again, when we talk about the doctrine of discovery and even reparations, because Black people utilize the language of the state with 40 acres and a mule. And again, indigenous people are like, there was no 40 acres to give away,
Yeah.
to promise anybody, because it did not belong to the state. It did not belong to the United States. So if we don't acknowledge that, then that's also a piece of how these systems are layered on top of each other.
I know it's absolutely true. The prosperity of America literally comes on the back of the fact that it was taken and just utilized. I mean, a lot of people could become rich if you just basically could walk somewhere and say, nobody's using this land, it's mine now, regardless of the conversation that might actually need to happen around that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I love what you're doing. And you actually just gave me another interesting way to demonstrate in a very current events sort of way, the idea of privilege, something we talk about quite often. And people don't always get it. But I mean, even just the fact that if you go to a protest and you see a bunch of white folks there that have probably, borrowed some time from work or, whatever, but they might still have a job or whatever, versus the Black folks there who are probably there out of desperation, is a different example of what kind of world we are living in and what privilege can look like when you don't even really think about it.
Right.
So no, I like that. So just to kind of complete the thought on the conciliation thing, what sorts of things could you imagine coming out of that as like a solution? Are we talking reparations or?
So I do. I think that reparations is one way to get to conciliation and equity as it relates to almost every industry, criminal justice reform, right? And how we even think about what is a crime and time served, and whether or not we should be looking at punitive models or restorative justice practices for our criminal justice systems, all of it. And definitely reparations is on the table. When I left Illinois, I was at an institution, the Center for Inner City Studies, and they were working on a project there. And this is about 15 years ago. They were working on a project there connecting banks like Bank of America, Chase, JP Morgan and Chase, to actual slave ships, to trace back the economic wealth from the slave industry to the continuous wealth of these banks. And literally, there are records that name the connection of these banks throughout centuries.
Wow.
to slave ships.
That's intense. I think most people would probably have this idea that there's a disconnect between our modern world and these entities that we've come to know. But to even think about, that they do have a relationship back to that 300, 400 years ago, even, that is very interesting.
Well,
Absolutely. Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, all of these entities have histories of wealth built off of exploitation.
yes. Well, and there was a question, especially as we're watching obviously the domino effect around COVID, a question that I really wanted to sort of explore of like, what's the difference between a poverty exploiter and a job creator? And I think we mostly have poverty exploiters in our country because the people who go to work can't afford to live really at all, or and if they're not, you shouldn't be this wrecked if you have a job, right? We're going to call it's a job creation where it's like some kind of respect between the worker and the investor and all of that. That's going to look different than when I'm perceiving as like this poverty exploiter. And I was like, it's an issue. And I'm hopeful that like the other things that we're seeing, that having the light shined on it will potentially inspire us as communities to push a little bit to make things different. I mean, I'm hopeful. I'm really hopeful.
Absolutely. and many of us hopefully were awakened to our complicity around the exploitation of poverty, right? During COVID-19, because as those of us who are in careers or industries where we could work from home, we were like, okay, well, I'm tired of the Zoom meetings, but I'll do it because, my health it matters. My job, I want to maintain it. And I have the internet access and stuff. So whatever, I'll just continue to work in this manner. But as we made that decision, we were still like, but I need toilet paper. And so somebody has to get up and go to that essential, because that's now what we want to call service workers, essential service worker job, to make sure that when I do my Postmates, that I get the toilet paper and the paper towels that I need so that I can work from home. Yeah. And so we become complicit in this exploitation of poverty.
No, my first thought was when everything started getting labeled as essential, it's like, oh, this is literally all service people. It's vocational people. None of these people probably have a summer home and a boat, right. They're not, that's not the world that we live in. And I was hopeful that people would actually start to appreciate these people that actually make our world work, especially, Absolutely. When it is things essential, like, plumbers and electricians they were considered essential and still needed to make sure people's houses were working properly or whatever. But then you got the grocery delivery people and the food delivery people, mm-hmm. And yeah, none of those people probably, owning their estates or anything. And but I do feel like, it's changed. People are starting to see it as that's just normal.
Right. Yeah. Amazon lost no money during COVID.
They printed money as far as I could tell.
Netflix or HBO, like none of the streaming services lost any money.
I work in the internet biz, and so, we didn't know exactly what was going to happen. We make a software platform for building websites for professional builders. So our customers are agencies building for SMBs and small to medium business size, companies. And the reality is we didn't know what was going to happen. So we immediately kind of went into, let's just see if our agencies are going to go down. If people stop paying for websites, that could be a problem for our customers to pay. Never happened. Not one company suffered except the one that I had that was in the hotel. They made websites for hotels. Mm-hmm. And so, it was so vertical, like business vertical specific, that it affected. But meanwhile, we haven't seen so many edits to websites. Everybody literally added, information to their front page about COVID. Are we open? Are we essential? Are we still shipping orders, but our physical stores closed? Just all that sort of thing. And, it was really eye-opening to kind of see just how uniquely vulnerable certain groups of people and certain business verticals really are to certain things. And again, very eye-opening to understand the ways in which we have taken a lot of things for granted.
Absolutely.
So I think we could probably talk to you for a long time. Thank you so much for being here. Before we go, is there anything that you would like to share with people about, how to get involved? Or, I'll post links in the show notes and everything like that. But anything you want to get out there?
Absolutely. The very first step is to take the pledge. So please visit us on www.truthandconciliation.org and take the pledge, and also share the pledge. Examine yourself. Why is this important for me? And then invite others into this work, because it is the growth of a grassroots movement. There are people who are calling for it or have called for similar things from the congressional level, and they need to keep doing that work. But our work is to build the groundswell from people across the country so that we can meet them in the middle when it's time to really get this as an infrastructure for the United States.
Well, we will definitely share that and get your info out there. Thank you so much for being on the show. We'd love to have you back. But at this point, we have a slew of people that I love bringing on because you have your finger on the pulse of a lot of things and you have a very good perspective. So if you'd be happy to come back, we'd be happy to have you. So
I would be delighted. And thank you. Thank you both for such a wonderful conversation and the work that you are doing. Because again, this is all of our work.
Yeah, it really is.
Really appreciate you. Thank you.
So thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, or thoughts, please find us on social media. We are BiCurean on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can email us at podcast@BiCurean.com.
And if you like what we are doing, please rate us on your listening platform of choice.
Thank you.